Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we are joined by Rob Sandbach, Managing Director of Indiespring, who is going to give you a rundown of options for deploying internal apps within your organization. Hi, Rob.
Dave, hello. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you everyone for joining us. It amazes me actually that over 10,000 people are interested in this topic. I'm looking forward to talking to you all about it. No, it's a dry one, but it's one that's important. For those who don't know Indiespring or me, I'm Rob. I'm the Managing Director and founder of Indiespring. We're an app agency that focuses on internal line of business applications. So these are the type of apps that don't generally go in the consumer-facing app stores, aren't generally used by the general public. They're deployed into organizations. They're used by employees, partners, suppliers. And typically they're sort of data logging, data capture. There might be telematics type applications for tracking assets. There could be sort of Bluetooth integration stuff with Internet of Things, ticketing, access control, all that kind of stuff. So we've developed a bit of a specialism in those sort of applications recently. And so we obviously often get asked by our clients, how do we get these apps into our businesses, into the hands of users? And there's an array of options. And so we're taking half an hour today to talk you through those and try and signpost a little bit as to what you might need to be thinking about and which direction might suit you based on your individual use case. So let's get going. So kind of briefly mentioned, we've been around for 12 years. As I say, we've developed this specialism. A lot of our work is recovery and taking on an existing legacy system and then improving it and rolling it forward. And yeah, as I say, we're looking forward to just talking through our findings, I suppose, and the different options open to you. So deploying internal apps, I thought it might be useful to just start with a classic definition slide, really. So by deploying, I looked up the dictionary definition. It's bringing into effective action, which I think summarizes it quite well. We're talking about taking the application once it's been tested and verified and getting it into the hands of users. So yes, that's installing the application onto the user's devices. There's also something there around controlling access to the application, who can get it and who can't. Also, the data on the application, ensuring that's securely contained within the application when it's deployed onto devices. Equally as important for these types of apps is suspending access as required, so being able to remove that data remotely potentially, or at least limit access to employees if they move on and retain the device. And another important one that's you need to consider in these types of applications is updating the application. So we're all used, I think, as consumers to having the app update occur mostly seamlessly now and in the background for most users, or some of us choose to prompt those, but it's all handled for us. Depending on how we deploy applications onto devices internally, that might not be the case. So we just need to think about that. And when we're talking about internal applications, as I discussed before, we mean existing or occurring within the organization. So it's generally deployed to a private audience. That would be your employees or perhaps a select group of partners and suppliers. And as I mentioned before, it's usually a line of business type application. So that might be some sort of CRM tool or employee management tool that's being used by your staff to communicate with sales opportunities, or indeed with each other or with their line managers. Sometimes it's a tool that's used to log data whilst engineers are out in the field and so on. Internal communications is a common use for this application. That's sort of classic intranet type replacement. Access control and ticketing, we do a lot of work in that space. So scanning codes for access using Bluetooth, RFID, that kind of thing to allow or not allow access to areas of sites. And then the other bit that we're doing more and more work in actually is using phones for tracking of people, telematics, assets, and that kind of thing. Which brings us nicely to a little case study of this type of application that highlights some of the challenges of deploying apps internally. We've worked with our partner called Safe Citizens. They essentially supply technology to the Thunderbirds of the real world. So these are people who are on the ground way ahead of charities when a natural disaster occurs, such as here as the earthquakes in Morocco. And they use our technology to track their personnel, to enable those personnel to communicate with one another, to be able to draw hotspots around areas that do or don't need support. And it's a life-saving application, but different first responders with different devices and different requirements. different organizations are going to require different ways of accessing the application, and it's imperative that they can access it, and that the application is maintained and kept up to date. So these are the kind of applications we're talking about at the extreme end. At the more mundane end, perhaps a data logging application for an engineer to log a security check or a safety check, excuse me, of a piece of equipment and make sure that's auditable and uploaded and so on. So I guess initially a high level view of your different deployment options. I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is whether we can deploy this application into the app stores, the public app stores, that is. And we'll discuss that decision a little bit. But if the answer is yes, then that's undoubtedly the best way to go. For a whole host of reasons that we'll come on to. If we can't, our options change then depending on whether we're deploying an Android application or an iOS application. Some internal applications are going to be both. So particularly if you're enabling users or requiring users to install the app onto their own consumer handsets, then it's very likely that you're going to need to offer both an Android and an iOS application. For applications where the business itself is supplying the handset, or indeed, it's using a third-party handset which happens to be running Android, typically they're going to be Android applications. Most businesses don't want to go to the expense of deploying iPhones and so forth for all of their employees, although that's by no means a complete. It's not always the case, is what I'm trying to say. Some businesses do opt to do that, but most are going to be relying on Android. And we'll talk about these different options depending on which way you go. So the simplest option is to deploy your internally focused application onto the public app store. So the obvious advantage there is it's the simplest, it's the easiest. The application is discoverable by everyone. It's almost zero cost versus your annual development fee. If you need things like payments, that's covered. Hosting, update, security, all that's covered. You get all access to all the analytics and app store optimization tools. And sometimes if you want people whom are not going to be able to register their device with you to receive the application to be able to receive it, this is your only option. So an example of one of our clients is they have a sales demo tool that allows them to demo some of their products and services to their prospects, but they want their prospects to be able to download this sort of catalog and information ahead of them arriving or afterwards. Well, the only way we can do that is by deploying it into the public app store, unless we're expecting every customer or prospect to hand over their device and allow us to register it and so on. So it's more common than you might think to have internal apps deployed into the public app store. There are challenges with that. We can't enforce updates or some of the other MDM benefits that we'll come on to, such as sandboxing and so on. The app is visible and downloadable by all. That's not to say that it can be accessed by all if it's behind obviously an authentication layer, but your competitors can download the application and start poking around and having a look at it if they want to. A big one is it has to conform to the App Store guidelines. So we'll come on to this, but I think most people will know both Apple and Android have quite stringent requirements around some simple stuff like usability and security and so on, but also a lot of commercial stuff too, which is designed to protect their commercial interests. And there are some restrictions there. Generally, they want public-facing apps in the App Store. So there's some grey language around these types of applications. You need to be able to demonstrate to particularly Apple when you deploy that there is a benefit to at least some small percentage of their audience, and it's not exclusively a private application. It's sort of a repeat of the point really, but your app is going to be reviewed by an App Store team, and that incurs time, it incurs cost, it incurs uncertainty, and it requires confirmation, that you're running to those guidelines. That said, we'll come on to the summary at the end, but if you need, as I said, external parties to also have access to this application and you're not supplying handsets to them and you can't get your hands physically on the handsets to enable deployment, this is your only option. So you're just going to have to live with the cons, I'm afraid. When we talk about private deployment, as I mentioned before, our options vary depending on whether we're deploying an Apple application or an Android application. So here we're talking about deploying an application to a subset of users that the general public cannot see or access. So if we're using Apple, we're looking at ad hoc distribution, or one of two, I guess, formalized schemes for doing this within the Apple ecosystem. They are enterprise applications and the newer custom applications, which were introduced in 2019. Actually, I was surprised to learn. It feels like yesterday, but they've been around 5 years now. On Android, we have a few more options, and it's a little more complex, but a little more open, as you might expect. We can sideload the applications, or we can deploy through the Play Store as a private application, or we can use an MDM solution, and we've got different options depending on whether the application is going to be running on what's called a GSM-enabled device or a non-GSM enabled device, which I'll come on to. As I mentioned, for these type of applications, I would say 90% of the time, we're looking at Android. There being an Android instance. There might be an iOS instance as well, but very rarely are these applications Apple only. The reason being, as I say, these types of applications largely fall into one of two camps. Either we're developing an application that we want to install on the user's own handset, what we call a bring your own device type environment. In that case, we're going to need to support Android and iPhone. If not, and we're providing the device, the business usually wants to keep the cost of those devices as low as possible, and is therefore choosing Android as the platform to develop on. It's also more open. It's also used by more third parties. If we're using things like Honeywell handsets, they're going to be running Android OS now, or a variant thereof. So typically, most of our customers are going to be looking at deploying onto the Android platform, which is why it's I guess it'd probably take up a bit more time in this webinar. But we'll start with Apple. We'll start with the I guess the more consumer-friendly solution. So I guess the first option, if you are looking to deploy into Apple, is to look at ad hoc distribution. I guess just as an overview, Apple over time are looking to control the development experience more and more with their acquisition of TestFlight and requirements for reviews there and so on. We're seeing them move away from an already quite difficult position for deploying apps internally, to it becoming more and more apparent that they want to be seeing, reviewing, and looking at apps that aren't actually ever going to go into the App Store. So I think there are two key, as we mentioned earlier, there are three key approaches split into two categories. One is to use ad hoc distribution, which is really bending a development tool and using it in a way that it wasn't its original intention, versus enterprise applications or custom application program, which is Apple's, I guess, more formalized and the correct, in inverted commas, ways of deploying an application within a business. And we'll discuss them at length, but even within that option, Apple are moving towards the custom application program, which mandates App Store reviews for releases. So there's very much a movement towards centralization of app distribution, even within organizations. That said, we can use that ad hoc distribution to distribute apps. So this is a tool that is really designed to allow users to test versions of an application before it's deployed. But in some use cases, it might be appropriate to use this as the actual distribution methodology. It has to be to a known pool of devices. So, you can't just have someone rock up and access an application. They need to then register the device, then it goes back to the developers, they reissue a build and so on. There are expiry rules, there are device limits and so on. But the pros are that it's no additional cost. If you can make iOS applications, you can do ad hoc distribution. It's simple to set up and easy to automate the deployment of these builds. There's no store review process, so that's a big one. It's quick. There's no limits to features. You can have the app do whatever you want. It never passes through Apple. That's wonderful. The challenges around this are that we can only ever have 200 devices on the program. Each device needs to be manually registered, which is a somewhat clunky process. So you either need to have one of your developers or IT staff manually get hold of the phone and run it through installing the certificate and setting it up with TestFlight and so on. Or you need to have users that are pretty tech savvy, one or the other. Each app is only valid for a year. But it could be argued that if you're deploying your app and updating it more than once a year anyway, then there's no real harm there. And manual updates are required. So this is quite an important one. The experience of going up and updating from one version of an app to another needs to be initiated by the user. So you're going to have to train your users to go and update their builds by hand, which can clearly be done through the app itself. You can nudge them and have the app stop working once a new one is available, but it's a little clunky. But that's ad hoc distribution. It's the next simplest way of doing things after deploying into the public app store. Private distribution, we've got two options, as I mentioned. The enterprise distribution program is essentially the panacea if you're eligible for it. So it allows you to deploy apps properly to an internal audience. It doesn't go through App Store reviews. There's a small additional fee. I think it's in the hundreds of dollars a year. It can only be used for in-house employees. It requires the use of an MDM as well. The big one is that Apple will only allow access to this program if you've got 100 employees or more. If you have 100 employees or more, this is the solution because it's designed to do exactly what you want and it doesn't come with any App Store review requirements. And as I've said there, it's sort of designed for completely proprietary apps, bespoke, the type of apps that we develop, deploying into larger organizations. And you know, because it uses an MDM solution and so on, you're going to need some level of IT support and knowledge, which you're likely to have at a business of that size anyway. Custom apps it's not been sold by Apple as a replacement for this program, but more and more, I think it's looking like it is. This effectively it's designed for service providers like Indiespring to take a single application and then deploy customized bespoke versions of it into different organizations. And we as the distributor or you as the distributor can choose which entities it's deployed into. You can use it to deploy just into one entity, i.e. your own. It has lots of the benefits of the enterprise distribution option, with the main challenge that the distribution is centralized through Apple, and so you need to go through their App Store review process. That means you need to conform with all of their requirements. Now, most of the requirements that are onerous that Apple place on apps are to do with revenue protection and commercial protection. That they often don't apply to privately distributed apps. We're not normally trying to monetize the user directly. So that might not be as big a challenge as you might think, but it's just something to be aware of. Frankly, if you're deploying an Android app, an Apple app, and you're not over 100 employees, this is probably your only option if you're not in a very small startup type environment and able to do the ad hoc solutions. On the Android side of things, we've got a few different options, but there's two core concepts we need to talk about first. The first is Google Mobile Services. So Android itself is a free open source software solution that's available for anyone to use, under the open source framework. Google provides a whole bunch of Google-powered services on top of that most consumer handsets are going to take advantage of. So things like Play Store access, particularly pertinent to today's discussion, enterprise control and MDM solutions, in-app purchasing, and so on. As I say, most consumer-facing, in fact, nearly all consumer-facing variants of Android are going to be running on Google Mobile Services underneath the hood. If that's, if you're going to be deploying to consumer handsets, you'll need to be deploying through an MDM that supports and is enabled by Google Mobile Services. However, there's a whole subset of Android devices that don't. So these are typically things like bespoke pieces of hardware that happen to be running Android OS. So as we mentioned, Honeywell scanners, or it could be terminal systems for industrial use, where the manufacturer has decided to use Android OS because that brings them advantages. You have the option of deploying applications onto those handsets, but they're not in no way linked to Google whatsoever. That's completely divorced, in which case they're not running Google Mobile Services. They are instead running vanilla Android, and you've got a different set of options open to you. With that concept understood, we also need to talk a little bit about device management. We touched on this earlier. Within the Android world, we tend to think of device is in one of three states. Either they're fully owned by the company, the corporate organization, such as a handset scanner and so on. So we are acquiring them. They're only for company use. We're handing them to our employees or partners. We have full control over them. Sometimes we have corporately owned, but with a personal environment. So we own the handset in a legal sense. We give it to our users, but then they are using for personal use as well. So we just need to be careful about how we ring fence and divide the data for each, for I guess each area of the handset. And the third one is that kind of bring your own device piece. So that's where the consumer is bringing the phone to us, and we need to carve out a little sandbox for us to run our applications within. So this is where things can get a little bit complex and our options open and close depending. But we need to understand, as the people deploying applications, do we need to support Google Mobile Service enabled Android instances, and what type of devices do we need to support? So we've got two options which don't require the use of an MDM. We can sideload. So this is the scenario whereby someone is emailed or messaged or linked via a distribution portal or something like that to a version of the application. Unlike Apple, we don't need the user to have registered their device ahead of time. We can encourage and teach the user how to enable the installation of applications from unknown sources. That's not a hugely difficult task, but in that bring your own device scenario, it does require the user to compromise their own, I guess, security and some of the protections around that signed applications bring in order to install your application, which might not be palatable for some organizations. You don't get auto updates, but there is no app review process. It's really simple. Someone just clicks a link, clicks install, and away they go. They've got the application. Again, a bit like the ad hoc distribution, but a bit more open in that we don't need to physically register every device and rebuild each time. Probably best suited to small technical teams that, there's 5 or 6 handsets that we can just quickly deploy the app onto for people over the wire. Job done, away they go. A really nice option that's available to Android applications that isn't available yet within Apple is we can use tracks within the Play Store. So we can register a group of people, such as employees or individual suppliers and so on. We can deploy through the regular consumer-facing Play Store, but only enable access to the application to those select cohorts. So it's a nice halfway house. It's not going to require any extra work on the development side. It does enable us to have these private audiences. It does require a full app review. Again, Google tends to be a bit easier and simpler than Apple. And again, most of the sticking points that we find tend to be around the commercial protection, which isn't often relevant to these types of applications. Sadly, we don't get auto updates, so we can't force the user to update the application or have that happen silently in the background. We do require the user to give us permissions to access things like location and so on. And it requires a GMS enabled device. So it's the Google Play Store. So this won't work on Honeywell handsets and so forth, but it's a good option. If we want to go to the next stage, then we're using some sort of MDM solution. So, mobile device management solutions typically enable a business to do the kinds of things we were talking about before. So secure areas of the phone, ensure that data can be remotely wiped, control access, ensure connection via VPN, that kind of thing. And you've got two options depending on whether you're deploying to a GSM-enabled cohort devices or a non-GSM-enabled cohort. This is getting a little bit technical, but Google Enterprise is a subsuite of services provided by GMS that enables MDMs to build some of these features into them. So most MDM solutions are designed to support consumer-facing devices. So they're built on Google Enterprise. It's a bit strange. Despite the fact that the MDM itself may try and hide the fact, actually distribution is still happening via the Play Store in the background, but we get some really key benefits that we didn't get on the private tracks feature. One is that the reviews are automated and they're only looking at code level reviews. So they're not bothered about functionality. They're not bothered about UX or accessibility. It's a quick automated review that we've never known fail for anything that wasn't, a huge code level bug. So that's a real benefit for speed and for assurance that you're going to get it deployed. A big one is that we can skip permissions requests. So particularly, this is important for corporately owned devices. We don't, if we need to, for example, if we're running a telematics solution, we don't have to prompt the user to give us access to their location, for example. Clearly on a device that they bring, we would ask them for that. But in the context of corporately owned devices, where the device will only be used for work scenarios, there's a whole bunch of permissions that we can just streamline things by auto enabling them using the MDM solution. We get that sandbox environment, so we're completely isolated from the user's personal area, whether that's a personal area on an enterprise device or an enterprise area on a personal device. We do get auto updates, and this again is really useful. So as the developers and we're controlling the application, we can automatically push the upgrade to everyone silently in the background and make sure all of our employees are running the latest version of an application. We can also use that to send different versions of different applications to different people, which can be useful. It only works with GSM supported devices. As mentioned, that's going to be nearly every Android phone that's available. And you know, I haven't got the Android version today, but it's several years now since Google Enterprise deployed. So we can do this for most consumer handsets in the wild, or most handsets that a corporate entity is likely to be purchasing and distributing to their employees. If we don't have Google GSM installed on our devices, then we have to use a legacy framework called Play EMM, which enables, I guess, some of these services. There are some specialized MDM solutions such as SOTI or VMware and so forth. In these cases, the MDM partner, the MDM supplier is partnering directly with the device manufacturer. And so they can enable potentially almost anything. There's no attachment to Google at all. There's no data distributed to them. The APKs and so on don't go via the Play Store. It's all completely detached. Most of our experiences with SOTI deploying onto things like Honeywell handsets. So we have an application that allows people to scan tickets and access areas. It's clearly distributed to employees of the organization. Via SOTI, we can do trial rollouts. We don't have to worry about permissions. We can force updates, rollback updates, all that kind of stuff. And none of this ever goes anywhere near Google. You have total control. With great power comes great responsibility and all of that. The key one is it won't work with consumer Android devices because they need to be GMS enabled and go through Google Enterprise and be using a Google Enterprise powered MDM. So this is your decision pathway. If the app needs to be downloaded by unknown users, you'll need to deploy publicly. If you've got a small technical team or they're located near a technical user and the users are bought in and it's an Android, an iPhone app, ad hoc might work. If not, and you're big enough, use enterprise. If not, you're going to be using custom applications and just have to put up with that review process. If you've got an Android application and you've got very small, savvy technical users, or you control the devices and they're brought back to base every day and you can handle all of that, side loading might be appropriate. Use private applications unless you have a very good reason not to, or you want to use some of the wider MDM features we've discussed. In which case, you're going to be dictated as to whether you use a GSM-enabled mobile device management platform or a non-GSM-enabled mobile device management platform. There are loads of different options in each case out there. If you do have any questions around which way to jump or which MDM to use, or I appreciate this has been a breakneck run through of your options, please don't hesitate to get in touch. This is what we do, believe it or not. We actually quite enjoy this kind of stuff. So reach out, let me know. I'm happy to talk through different options with you. And if we don't know the answers, we know the people who do. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time. I can see that 9,500 people are still with us. So wonderful. I can't believe it's been so popular. Look forward to hearing from you all. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Rob. Really in-depth view of the many options. And yeah, bang on 30 minutes, mate. So good rattling through to get that on time. I was a bit worried when you sent me the slides over that you weren't going to manage. Yeah, I'll leave this slide up. Rob's willing to answer any questions you've got, but we're aware it's 4 o'clock. So yeah, please email him with anything that you'd like to ask. And thanks to everyone for attending today, and we will see you next time.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.